Okay, today we are doing just a quick video on Susan Glaspell and the play Trifles. So hopefully you've read that. If you have your textbooks, make sure you have those open to page 241, which is where the play starts. But first, let me just give you some quick background information on Glaspell. So you can see her dates there that she lived right at the turn of the century and is from the Midwest, grew up in Iowa. And she was a journalist there and was in journalism for quite some time, but was definitely interested in creative writing, specifically writing plays. And so she eventually moved to New York City to pursue a career in theater, and that's where she met her husband, and they were both part of this acting company. And so she was involved in every part of the process, from writing plays to directing to acting. So I'm really intimately acquainted with drama. And the play Trifles, which you guys read, just this one act play, not very long at all, is actually based on real life events. And so the story goes that when Glaspell was a reporter for the Des Moines News, she covered the murder trial of a farmer's wife. And this woman, her name was Margaret Hossack, her husband had been murdered by someone hitting him in the head with an axe. And at first they assumed it was like robbers or burglars. And then as the investigation went on, more details came out that she became a prime suspect because she was unhappy in her marriage. And so for Susan Glaspell, she found it very interesting that over the course of time, she wrote several articles about this murder case, that she was actually feeling more and more sympathy for the accused murderer because of the circumstances of her marriage. So that really piqued her interest, that this woman had, yes, committed a horrific crime, but she found herself having sympathy for her. So I'm sure you can see some threads of connection already if you read the play between that story and the play itself. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So one of the really interesting things about Trifles is that the main character, her name is Minnie, is off stage. She never shows up in the whole play. She doesn't have any lines. So everything we learn about her, we learn from the other characters, primarily from the two women in the play, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. And so the main thing we learn about Minnie's character that I want you to take away there is this idea that she was a very different person before she got married versus after she got married. And so look at page 248. I'm going to jump around a little bit and read you some different quotes. So page 248, about halfway down the page, Mrs. Hale is talking, and she's talking about Minnie Foster. And she says, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. So that's interesting. Even very overtly, Mrs. Hale says that she changed. And then they talk about, later in the play, they talk about how Minnie was not really involved in the community, how she was very isolated on this farm. And just these different details come out that she was just alone. She didn't have any children. And so as opposed to singing in the choir and being involved in the community, after her marriage, she becomes this much more silent character. She's very isolated. She's very separate from the community. So that tells you something about the state of her marriage. And then as to why Glaspell keeps her off stage, it just makes you wonder more about her as a character, maybe have a little more sympathy for her. She's a character in your imagination versus someone you're actually looking at. So that's really just an interesting choice about the protagonist of this play. And then John Wright, who's Minnie's husband, so he is the murdered here. And we learn about him as well from the women, both the women and the men in the play, really. Um, I'm still on page 248 here. I'll read you this quote. Mrs. Hale says, yes, he was a good man. He didn't drink and kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time of day with him, like a raw wind that gets to the bone. So he's described as a good man in the sense that, he wasn't a liar or a cheat or anything like that, but he's also described as a very cold man. And another quote I'll draw your attention to that I think lends some credibility to this idea that John Wright just wasn't a very kind person. Look back at page 242. So back to earlier in the play, page 242. And this is actually the neighbor who is telling the account of how he found that John Wright had been killed. So this is Mr. Hale, the neighbor. And so towards the top of the page, he says, Harry and I started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, we're going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he wanted was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself. But I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John. So here we have kind of confirmed the idea that John Wright is a loner, he's not very friendly, and also Mr. Hale even observes that he really doesn't seem to care too much about what his wife wants. And this is significant because the men in this play are portrayed as not very insightful. They have very one-track mind, figure out who the murderer is, and they don't really pay attention to all these other little details that the women do in order to solve the mystery of who killed John Wright. And so the fact that Glaspell chooses for him to be able to see that John Wright didn't really care about his wife's desires is an important thing to note. So basically what we have established here is that it doesn't seem like a very happy marriage. It doesn't seem like Minnie was treated particularly well. There's no overt abuse or anything like that, but we know that she seems to be unhappy in this situation. So on to Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. They're the two characters. They're kind of our conduit of information. So they're you could actually make the argument that they're like the main characters of the play, as they have the most dialogue here. And they're similar in that they're both women, right? So they're both kind of on the fringe of the investigation. The men are the ones who are in charge, and they're have authority and they have power, and they're walking around trying to figure things out. Whereas Mrs. Peter and Mrs. Hale are kind of in the background, doing, less important things, just kind of observing. So that brings them together, the fact that they're women and in this case, kind of second-tier citizens here. And this is, if you haven't noticed yet, this is definitely a feminist play. There's a feminist agenda here. What makes them different is Mrs. Hale, she was Minnie's neighbor and knew her for a long period of time, and she seems from the get-go to be very, very sympathetic to Minnie's plight, to this situation. And so she is very quick to side with Minnie, to justify her choices, to come to her aid. Whereas Mrs. Peters, her husband is the sheriff, and she seems much more in the camp of justice being very black and white, and the law has got to punish crime. And she definitely seems to come down a little harder on, well, if she did the wrong thing, then she has to be punished. So in that sense, their view of justice is pretty different. So as we walk through what's happening here, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, the primary setting that we get the dialogue is the kitchen, the main living area. And that is significant because this is the woman's domain. Right? The woman's domain is the home. And what's interesting is the men don't really pay much attention to what's going on in the kitchen, in the living area. Look at page 244. Um, so they walk in, and the kitchen is very dirty. And the very top of page 244, the county attorney is noticing that he says, dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? So he's basically saying, like, well, Minnie didn't keep her house very well. And Mrs. Hale is very defensive. She says, there's a great deal of work to be done on a farm. Um, and then she says again, those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. And the county attorney says, loyal to your sex. So right away there's this division about how the men view the house and how the women view the house. So it is significant that the setting is a woman's domain, and the women seem very much taking ownership of that, whereas the men view it as unimportant and insignificant. So the next thing I want to talk about is Mrs. Peters as a character. She actually is the one character in this play who undergoes some significant change, which is important thematically. It's important as far as the feminist agenda going on here. So the men are upstairs investigating. They go outside and they investigate. And so Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they're, just hanging out in the kitchen, like looking around, talking about Minnie, talking about the situation. So they, first they find the bird cage, right? This broken bird cage. And then they eventually find a little canary, right? The dead bird. And they don't know how it died, but you can see that they kind of intuit that perhaps John Wright killed the bird, and maybe that was Minnie's trigger. Maybe that's what made her snap and kill her husband. So as they're talking about this, look at page 249. Let's look at this conversation that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters have. So Mrs. Hale says she liked the bird. She was going to bury that. She was going to bury it in that pretty box. And then Mrs. Peters says, when I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him. So you can see what's happening here is Mrs. Peters is starting to sympathize with Minnie. She says, wow, Minnie had this pet bird, and if her husband killed it, well, I would have been upset about that too. I was upset when someone hurt my kitten. And so she's starting to identify with Minnie. She's starting to feel sympathy for her. But you can see there's a lot of tension in her character on this page because Mrs. Hale says, I wonder how it would seem never to have any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like a bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too. So there's some symbolism going on there, obviously. And Mrs. Peters says, well, we don't know who killed the bird. Mrs. Hale says, I knew John Wright. And here you can hear Mrs. Peters struggle. She says, it was an awful thing done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale, killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him. And so you can see that she kind of goes back and forth. She's like, well, it was a terrible crime and that needs to be punished. But she also feels sympathy for Minnie. And so we see that tension in her character as she is grappling with this idea, and this is the primary theme in the play, is this idea of justice, which brings us to this discussion question of how do the men and women perceive justice throughout the play? And, do their views change? So we'll start with the men. Their view does not change at all. They view justice as very black and white. If someone has committed a crime, they must be punished. Whereas the women, through their conversation, through their observations about Minnie's life, about how her life changed after marriage, their view of justice is a little more malleable. They consider the circumstances. They consider the pressure that Minnie was under as a lonely wife, as a lonely person. And Mrs. Hale even feels this very personal guilt. She's like, oh, I should have visited Minnie more often. And that was a crime. So she actually takes some of the responsibility upon herself. Like, well, if I had been more involved, if I had been a better neighbor, maybe she wouldn't have snapped. And so the women's view of justice, like I said, it's much more multifaceted. And that is what Glaspell wants us to think about. She wants us to consider, what is justice? Do we take into account someone who is in a, psychologically oppressed state? Or do we just, does the law apply to everyone the same? And so these are the questions she wants us to grapple with. And obviously we're looking through a feminist lens here because that's a big major point of the play. But that's the big idea. I will discuss quickly some symbolism in the play. First of all, and this is the most obvious symbol, is this bird, this little songbird that Minnie had. And in a lot of ways that represents Minnie herself, right? It was a beautiful bird. It had a voice. It sang just like Minnie used to sing. But that bird was in a cage, just like Minnie was in a cage. And even further, you could make the argument that the bird got out of the cage at the end of the play. However, in doing so, it lost its life. It was strangled in the same way that Minnie lost her voice. Her voice was strangled by her husband, and she kind of snapped in trying to escape that cage. So lots of symbolism there with the bird. The jars of preserves. So at the very beginning, they walk in and they see that Minnie's, all her jellies and preserves that she had put up over the summer had been ruined because it was a very cold night. And because no one was in the house, the fire went out. And as you know, anything liquid, when it freezes, that, it expands. And so it caused the jars to burst. Like if you put a jar of jelly in the freezer, right? That glass would eventually explode if it was really full. So that's symbolic of Minnie's, her environment, right? Like, again, Minnie kind of is the jar of preserves in that she's in a very cold environment, and eventually, under that kind of pressure, she explodes. So there's some neat imagery there. And then finally, the quilt. The women find this quilt and the stitching had been very neat and tidy, except for the last section that was very, jagged and messy. And that kind of represents Minnie's state of mind, right? At the very end, she kind of lost her, she really lost her mind, right? She snapped, she went crazy and killed her husband. So that's also representative of Minnie and her state of mind. I also want to mention the title of the play, Trifles, which the word trifle, if something is a trifle, then it is considered unimportant, insignificant. And there's a line in the play where the men are kind of laughing at the women when the women are like noticing a small thing like the jar of preserves. And they're like, oh, well, women are used to worrying about trifles. And of course, the irony here is all these little trifles, the preserves, the quilt, the bird, all those things led the women to solve the murder. So the irony is that the trifles actually were very important. And if the men had paid more attention and had valued those quote-unquote women's things, then they would have actually had more insight. So that's the title there. And then finally, obviously, Glaspell's message regarding gender roles is a clear feminist call here that in Minnie's case, her oppression led her to, a sense of insanity in killing her husband and taking, revenge on his oppression. And also Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they decide, because they know the system would be so biased against Minnie, they decide to take justice into their own hands. They hide the evidence, and they become, in a sense, they are her jury. There's actually a short story version of this play called A Jury of Her Peers, and the implication there is that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they are Minnie's peers, and so they make the decision about what her sentence should be, and they, in essence, excuse her. Whereas if Minnie had actually gone to court in this time period, the early 1900s, then her jury would have been all male. So she would not have actually had a jury of her peers in that sense. So Glaspell is tying in this theme of justice with her message of gender roles and saying that the status quo is not just. The way that gender roles currently are in society is not furthering a true justice in that sense of the word. And these are the issues that she wants her audience to consider. So overall, it's a really cool play, kind of a whodunit. Although from the beginning it's pretty obvious who done it. But again, it's neat to be able to develop the character of Minnie and John Wright through the lens of these other characters and understand it in that way. So I hope you enjoyed reading it, and I hope that this brings you some clarity to the overall meaning. And thanks for listening.